So let me tell you about a line that Donald Trump has been talking about erasing since the first day of his second term. He described it in the Oval Office to Mark Carney's face as an artificially drawn line. He described it on Truth Social as just a straight line right across the top of the country, drawn with a ruler by somebody who had no idea what they were agreeing to. He described it in rally language, in casual asides to reporters on the White House lawn, in dinner table conversations with foreign leaders, in the specific obsessive register of a man who has decided that a border is not a sovereign fact, but a bureaucratic inconvenience, a line on a map that could be redrawn, should be redrawn, and will be redrawn if the right amount of pressure is applied to the country on the other side of it. He spent 15 months applying that pressure: tariffs, annexation threats, 51st state rhetoric, governor as an insult, the Board of Peace invitation revoked, Gulfstream jets decertified on social media at night, trade talks terminated over a television advertisement. An Ontario aluminum company offered tariff relief if it committed to moving its jobs across the line to American soil. Every instrument in the playbook of economic coercion applied to the single proposition that the line between Canada and the United States should dissolve, that Canada should dissolve into it, that the border's erasure was the endpoint toward which 15 months of pressure had been building. And then on November 19, 2025, in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories, Mark Carney got something signed. Not the Canada-United States border. A different line, the lines inside Canada, the dozens of invisible walls that had divided Canadian provinces from each other for decades, that had made it more expensive to move a product from Quebec to Ontario than from Quebec to Germany, that had required a nurse certified in British Columbia to start her licensing process from scratch before she could work in Alberta, that had stopped a bottle of Nova Scotia wine from being sold in a Manitoba liquor store without navigating a regulatory system designed in a different era for different purposes by governments that had stopped believing the effort to dismantle it was worth the political cost. Those lines. Carney erased those, all at once, with one agreement signed by every province, every territory, and the federal government simultaneously in a meeting that the government called the First Ministers' Meeting on Building Canada Strong, in a room full of the premiers and ministers who had spent years explaining why their particular barrier was different, their particular exception was necessary, their particular regulation couldn't be harmonized without causing a disruption that their province couldn't absorb. They all signed. All of them. Every jurisdiction on the map of Canada committed in writing to a single Canadian market. And the irony that every diplomatic correspondent who covered both stories understood immediately, and that no one in the Trump administration appears to have processed at all, is this. The American president spent 15 months trying to erase the border between the United States and Canada. The Canadian Prime Minister spent those same 15 months erasing the borders between Canadian provinces. Trump tried to make Canada disappear into America. Carney made Canada into a single country for the first time in its history, and Warren Buffett said, the leader who tried to erase the other country's sovereignty accidentally funded the creation of that country's most powerful domestic market in 158 years. Hit subscribe, because by June 2026, which is this month, every good approved for sale in one Canadian province can be sold in any other without additional testing, paperwork, or fees. The financial services chapter comes into force in the same month, and the direct-to-consumer alcohol agreement enters effect, completing the most comprehensive transformation of Canada's internal economy since Confederation. Let me take you through what the Canadian Mutual Recognition Agreement on Goods actually did, because the scope of it is the story, and the scope has been almost entirely invisible in the coverage of the trade war that provoked it. For most of Canada's history as a country, a product made in one province faced different regulatory requirements in every other province before it could be sold. A toy manufactured to Ontario safety standards had to pass through a separate certification process before it could be sold in a store in British Columbia. A vehicle component built to Alberta specifications needed additional approvals before it could be shipped to Quebec customers. Clothing, industrial products, health technology, every category of good that consumers and businesses buy and sell across the country was subject to a patchwork of provincial regulations that each made sense within the province that designed them and collectively made no sense as a national market. The cost of this patchwork was estimated at the high end of research at $200 billion annually in lost economic output, not the cost of tariffs, not the cost of American trade barriers, the cost of Canada trading with itself across its own internal walls, $200 billion in a country whose total annual GDP runs at approximately $2.2 trillion. Internal trade barriers were costing somewhere between a fraction of that estimate and, at the high end, nearly 10% of total economic output. The reason the high-end number is disputed is that most of the barriers are invisible. They do not appear in any tariff schedule. No customs official at the Manitoba-Ontario border stops a truck and demands payment. The barriers work through regulatory divergence, through the cost of compliance with multiple sets of standards, through the deterrent effect on businesses that decide it is easier to stay in their home province than to navigate the legal architecture of 11 others, and through the cumulative weight of a system designed, however unintentionally, to make Canada's 13 separate markets easier to trade with foreign countries than with each other. The Canadian Mutual Recognition Agreement, signed on November 19, 2025, addressed this at the most fundamental level available without requiring constitutional amendment. It established the principle of mutual recognition. A good lawfully sold in one province or territory can be sold in any other without facing further requirements. One standard, one approval process, one market for goods. The agreement covered thousands of products immediately: toys, clothing, vehicles, health technology, industrial goods, the categories where regulatory divergence was most costly and most clearly unnecessary, where the Ontario Safety Standard and the British Columbia Safety Standard were functionally identical but institutionally separate. British Columbia's Minister of Jobs and Economic Growth, Ravi Kahlon, who was at the announcement, put the principle in the most direct language available. We are creating one agreement, one market, and unlimited opportunity across the country. One agreement, one market, the language of a country that had spent 158 years operating as a collection of trading relationships and had decided, under the pressure of an American president who was threatening to erase its sovereign border, to become something it had technically been since 1867, but had never fully realized in economic practice. A single country, and this is the specific irony that Carney had been building toward from the moment he stood at Davos in January of 2026 and called the American-led order a fiction. When Trump called the Canada-U.S. border an artificially drawn line, he was applying the language of obsolescence to a sovereign border. He was saying the line does not serve the purpose it was drawn for, does not reflect the economic reality of the continent, and should be replaced by a larger political unit that makes more sense. Carney heard that argument, and he applied the identical logic to Canada's internal borders. The lines between Canadian provinces are also, in the historical sense, artificial. They were drawn by politicians in the 19th century who were dividing up administrative responsibilities and who did not anticipate the regulatory divergence those lines would produce over the following century and a half. They do not reflect the economic logic of a modern manufacturing system that needs to move goods at continental scale. They impose costs that no rational designer of a national economy would impose, and they can be erased, not through annexation, through signature. Through the political will of 13 jurisdictions that looked at the trade war being waged against their country and concluded that the most powerful response was not just to fight the external threat, but to remove the internal divisions that made the external threat more costly to absorb. The country that Trump was trying to dissolve into the United States became, in the 15 months of his pressure campaign, more internally unified than it had been at any point since the British North America Act was signed. The dissolution Trump demanded produced the integration Carney delivered, and the integration delivered through the CMRA will outlast the trade war, the CUSMA review, the Section 122 tariff expiry, and every other deadline on the bilateral calendar. Because internal markets, once opened, do not close when the external pressure that opened them is resolved. They stay open. They grow. They become the foundation of an economy that does not need any single foreign market to function. Warren Buffett said the most consequential economic reforms in business history are almost never the ones that were planned in conditions of calm. They are the ones that were forced by conditions of crisis that would never have achieved the political consensus required for passage without the emergency that made the political cost of not acting greater than the political cost of acting. He cited the bank consolidations that followed the financial crises of the 20th century, the supply chain integrations that followed the COVID shutdowns, the regulatory harmonizations that followed the oil shocks of the 1970s. Every one of those reforms was discussed, analyzed, and recommended by economists for years before the crisis that finally produced the political will to implement them. He said the Canada internal trade reform is the clearest example he has seen in this decade of a crisis producing a reform that the absence of crisis had prevented for generations. The internal trade barriers in Canada were studied, costed, and condemned by economists for 40 years before Trump imposed the tariffs that made removing them a political necessity rather than a policy aspiration. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce said removing barriers will not be enough to entirely offset the damage from the trade war with the United States. It was, they said, a good start. Warren Buffett said when the Chamber of Commerce of the world's 10th largest economy calls a $200 billion domestic market integration a good start, the ambition has already outpaced the crisis that produced it. And that is exactly the condition under which transformative economic reform becomes permanent. The Free Trade and Labor Mobility in Canada Act, which received royal assent on June 26, 2025, and came into force on January 1, 2026, is the federal legislative complement to the provincial CMRA signing. The Act removed all remaining federal exceptions to the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. All of them. The federal government had introduced the CFTA in 2017 with 53 federal exceptions, carve-outs for specific policy areas where Ottawa had decided that federal regulations should override the free trade principle. By June of 2025, all 53 had been removed. Every single one. The Act also established the principle that a good produced and distributed in line with the requirements of a province or territory will be recognized as meeting comparable federal requirements. The mutual recognition principle applied at the federal level, and the Act complemented the free trade and labor mobility piece, the change that matters most to the workers and professionals whose ability to move across provincial borders had been constrained by the same regulatory patchwork that constrained the movement of goods. A nurse certified in British Columbia can now work in Alberta without reapplying for her nursing license. A construction tradesperson qualified in Ontario can take a job in New Brunswick without going through the entire certification process again. A massage therapist licensed in Quebec can offer services in Saskatchewan. The worker whose expertise was locked into a single province by the administrative burden of interprovincial certification is now a worker who can follow the work wherever in Canada the work is. And the labor mobility that results is not just a social good. It is an economic multiplier. A country where skilled workers can move freely in response to labor market signals is a country that can allocate its human capital more efficiently than a country where administrative friction determines where people can work. And a country that allocates its human capital efficiently is a country that can absorb economic shocks without permanently losing its productive capacity to the region or the jurisdiction that imposed the shock. Ontario has gone the farthest, fastest of any provincial government. The Protect Ontario Through Free Trade Within Canada Act 2025 introduced an as-of-right framework that eliminated licensing duplication across provinces for regulated professions. Effective January 1, 2026, certified professionals including insurance agents, brokers, and adjusters can work in Ontario under near-automatic recognition of their qualifications from other provinces with only a 6-month window to complete any remaining final licensing requirements. The regulators themselves are now bound by timelines. Applications must be acknowledged within 10 business days. Decisions must be issued within 30 days. The professional, whose credential application used to disappear into a regulatory system with no statutory response time now, has a guarantee that the system will act within a month. Ontario also signed memoranda of understanding with Alberta, Saskatchewan, and New Brunswick that, while not legally binding at the provincial level in those provinces, committed all signing parties to advancing interprovincial trade and credential recognition on a defined timeline. British Columbia introduced Bill 5, the Trade Recognition Act, in February of 2026, to make the province's mutual recognition framework permanent. The Economic Stabilization and Tariff Response Act, the emergency legislation BC had passed as a rapid response to American tariff threats, was designed as temporary. Bill 5 converts the permanent architecture of mutual recognition into a standing legal commitment rather than an emergency measure, ensuring that when the trade war eventually resolves, the internal trade framework does not revert to the status quo ante. The Look West strategy that BC has been articulating, diversifying trade, expanding market access, positioning the province as Canada's Pacific gateway to Asian markets, is built on the domestic integration that the Trade Recognition Act makes permanent. You cannot bridge the EU and the CPTPP through a Canadian corridor, as Carney proposed at the Yerevan summit, if the Canadian provinces through which that corridor passes are not themselves integrated into a single regulatory market. The specific mechanism by which the CMRA signing in Yellowknife on November 19, 2025 connects directly to Trump's annexation rhetoric is not subtle. It is architectural. Trump's argument for erasing the Canada-United border rested on the claim that the border was economically irrational, that the two economies were so integrated that the political line between them was a costly anachronism. The argument was wrong in its conclusion, but not entirely wrong in its observation. The two economies are deeply integrated. $700 billion in annual two-way trade, supply chains that cross the border 8 times before producing a single finished vehicle, energy grids that are physically interconnected from the Pacific Northwest to the Great Lakes to the Atlantic. The integration is real and deep, but the conclusion that Trump drew, that deep integration requires political unification, is the argument of a party that defines integration on its own terms. Carney's counter-argument, articulated not in a speech, but in the architecture of the CMRA and the Free Trade and Labor Mobility in Canada Act, is that deep integration can be achieved without political subordination. That a country can integrate its own internal markets to a degree that produces the economic scale advantages Trump was using to justify annexation without requiring the country to cease existing as a sovereign entity. You want a large integrated market? Canada is building one. You want labor mobility across jurisdictions? Canada has it. You want a single set of product standards that allows goods to move without recertification? Canada signed that agreement in November. The economic arguments for annexation are being dismantled one provincial trade barrier at a time by a prime minister who understood that the most powerful response to the claim that Canada needs to be absorbed into America is to demonstrate through legislation that Canada's economic potential can be realized within Canada. The numbers that the Spring Economic Update, tabled in late April 2026, put on the One Canadian Economy strategy are the measure of what has been accomplished and what the trajectory of accomplishment looks like. Since January 1, 2025, federal, provincial, and territorial governments have removed 94 exceptions to the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, 30% of the 296 exceptions that existed at the start of the year. Of those 94, 39 were federal exceptions. And combined with the previously removed exceptions, the federal government has now eliminated all 53 of its exceptions to the agreement since its introduction in 2017. 94 exceptions removed in 12 months. In a country that had spent 40 years being told that removing internal trade barriers was economically important, but politically impossible because every province had a constituency for every exception. 12 months of trade war pressure produced 30% of the total exception removal in a single year. The BC Food and Beverage Association Chief Executive James Donaldson said it at the November signing with the honest surprise of someone who had been advocating for internal trade reform for years. Maybe a side benefit of some of the tariff threats Canada has faced is that it is kind of forcing the provinces to work together in a more constructive way. The side benefit produced by 15 months of American economic coercion is the political integration that decades of academic research and business advocacy could not produce in the absence of an external threat. And the direct-to-consumer alcohol sales agreement, which allows consumers to purchase wine, beer, and spirits from a winery, brewery, or distillery in another province and have it shipped directly to their home, comes into effect this month in May of 2026. Not a regulatory change that affects business-to-business trade, a consumer-facing change that every Canadian who has ever wanted to order a bottle of wine from Prince Edward Island or a craft beer from British Columbia will notice in their daily life. The One Canadian Economy is not just a legislative framework. It is, starting this month, the product that shows up at your door from the province you ordered it from. The trucking MOU that the Committee on Internal Trade endorsed is the physical complement to the regulatory mutual recognition architecture. When Carney's trade diversification strategy points toward building internal east-west trade corridors that make Canada less dependent on north-south flows to American markets, those corridors require trucks that can cross provincial lines without facing different regulatory requirements in each jurisdiction. An interprovincial trucking MOU that reduces barriers in the trucking sector and facilitates the efficient movement of goods across the country is the logistics layer underneath the regulatory layer. And one economist commenting on the internal trade reform said the thing that captures the whole structural argument in a single sentence. When you leave Vancouver, is it easier to get to Los Angeles or to Winnipeg? They are roughly the same distance from each other. You zip to the American border, get onto I-5, and you can go all the way to Mexico. Most of Canada's road infrastructure, as this economist notes, is catered to trading with the United States rather than between provinces. The trade war made obvious a geographic truth that the bilateral relationship had always obscured. Canada built roads south because that was where the customers were. One Canadian Economy means building the roads east and west and finding the customers among 40 million Canadians who are, starting this month, living in a single market for the first time in the country's history. And Trump, who called the border artificial, who called it a line drawn with a ruler, who spent 15 months pressuring the country on the other side of it to dissolve, watched all of this happen and appears to have understood none of it. His response to the CMRA signing in Yellowknife was not a statement. There was no Truth Social post about the One Canadian Economy Act, no White House briefing on the strategic implications of Canadian provincial trade barrier removal, no acknowledgement from Greer or Lutnick or Besant or any member of the trade war team that the country they had been pressuring to accept American economic dominance had responded to that pressure by building an internal market at a scale and speed that no external threat had previously produced. The war room that went to work on the morning of the CUSMA tariff fights, that analyzed the steel quota negotiations, that modeled the GM and Stellantis production cuts, that tracked the EU partnership agreements and the Yerevan summit and the LNG shipments from Kitimat and the West Coast pipeline announcement, that war room appears not to have modeled the scenario in which Canada responds to American pressure by becoming more internally integrated, more self-sufficient, more capable of sustaining its own economy without American market access, more structurally resilient to the specific instrument the trade war was using to try to break it, because the trade war's instrument is American market access. Tariff it, restrict it, threaten it, make it expensive and uncertain and contingent on Canadian compliance with American demands. And Canada's response to that instrument is to make American market access less essential by making the Canadian domestic market larger, more integrated, and more capable of absorbing the economic output that the trade war is trying to redirect south on American terms. Warren Buffett closed his analysis of the One Canadian Economy transformation with the observation that has defined his commentary on every bilateral trade conflict he has watched in 7 decades. He said the paradox of economic coercion is that it always produces the one outcome the coercing party is trying to prevent. You apply pressure to a dependent party to make them more dependent. The dependent party responds to the pressure by building the infrastructure that makes them less dependent. You apply more pressure. They build more infrastructure. And by the time the pressure has run its course, the dependent party has become independent in the specific dimension the coercion was designed to exploit. He said Trump applied tariff pressure to make Canada more dependent on American market access. Canada responded by creating the largest domestic market expansion in its history since Confederation. The One Canadian Economy Act did not just make Canada more self-sufficient, it made every subsequent American tariff threat less effective than the one before it, because the domestic market that absorbs what the American market rejects is larger after every CMRA signing and every provincial exception removed and every MOU on trucking and every direct-to-consumer wine shipment from the winery next province over. The pressure has produced its own antidote, and the antidote will outlast the pressure. So here's where we stand today, May the 8th of 2026, 54 days before the CUSMA review deadline. On November 19th, 2025, every province, every territory, and the federal government of Canada signed the Canadian Mutual Recognition Agreement on goods, erasing the regulatory lines between Canadian provinces for thousands of product categories. The Free Trade and Labour Mobility in Canada Act came into force on January 1st, 2026, removing all 53 federal exceptions to the Canadian Free Trade Agreement and establishing labour mobility rights for workers across provincial borders. By June of 2026, which is this month, all goods except food and alcohol approved for sale in one Canadian province can be sold in any other without additional testing, paperwork, or fees. The direct-to-consumer alcohol agreement enters effect this month. The financial services chapter of the CFTA comes into force this month. Ontario's as-of-right professional recognition framework has been active since January. British Columbia has made its mutual recognition framework permanent through Bill 5, the Trade Recognition Act. 94 exceptions to internal trade have been removed since January 2025. The potential GDP boost from full barrier removal is estimated at up to $200 billion. The internal trade reform that 40 years of academic advocacy failed to produce was delivered in 12 months of American tariff pressure. And Trump, who called the Canada-U.S. border an artificially drawn line that should be erased, watched the prime minister he called governor erase a different set of lines entirely, the ones that had kept Canada from being the single unified economy that its constitution promised in 1867 and that its trade policy consistently prevented until his tariffs made preventing it politically impossible. Can a tariff regime that was designed to make Canada more economically dependent on American market access reverse the domestic market integration that its own pressure produced? Can the CUSMA review restore the bilateral trade relationship to a configuration that makes American market access essential to Canadian planning when Canada has spent 15 months building the domestic market that makes it optional? And the question that the Yellowknife signing and the Davos speech and the 11 words about energy and the Yerevan summit and the West Coast pipeline and the $1.5 billion BDC deployment and every other move in the 15-month strategic repositioning have all been building toward, when a country of 40 million people spends 15 months under economic pressure from the most powerful economy on earth, and responds by becoming more internally unified, more externally diversified, more institutionally integrated, and more strategically self-sufficient than it has been at any point in its 158-year history, who exactly is the pressure working on? Trump tried to erase the border. Carney erased the lines inside Canada instead. And the country that emerges from the trade war on the other side of the CUSMA review will be a country that built itself into something larger than the external threat that tried to diminish it. With one signature, in Yellowknife, on November 19th, while Washington was focused on the tariff schedule.